Good morning. We're on the grounds of the Okefenokee Heritage Center once again, and we're trying to bring you something that's educational and something that we hope you'll enjoy viewing. And what we have this morning is we've got a train authority with us, and this young man named Zane Williams. And this is the 110th birthday of Old Nine, and he knows more about Old Nine than all of us do put together. So we're very fortunate to have him with us this morning, and we're going to let him do a little narrative of the train and tell us all we can understand.
Thank you for having me. So the locomotive itself was built in November of 1912 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Now the history of the locomotive actually goes back to its sister locomotive, the 19, when it was built for the Woodward and Iron Company a few years before Old Nine was. So the locomotive 19, the railroad liked it so much they wanted an exact copy of the locomotive, so they went to the Baldwin Locomotive Works and ordered Old Nine. Back then it was known as 31. So the locomotive worked for the Woodward Iron Company for a few years, maybe up until like the 1960s, and then both the 19 and 31 were sold to the Rockton Ryan Railroad in the early 1960s, and they worked up there for a few years until maybe like the early 70s, and the locomotive was stored in like Fairfield Enterprise or whatever, and so the 19 is still up in South Carolina as of right now. The locomotive was purchased by the Okefenokee Heritage Center in, what was it?
1975.
1975, and now it's here on the property right now, and it was renumbered to 9 to represent the 9th stop of Old Nine, since it was a 9th stop right here in Waycross. So now the locomotive is going to be turning 110 years old in November, which is next month, and that's pretty much a brief history of the locomotive.
Is this a common engine type that was utilized in this period of time that it was made?
Yes, this is a Mikado locomotive. This type was a 282, and this was a pretty common freight locomotive for most of the United States railroads. So they were used to haul freight.
Whenever you say Mikado, what does that mean?
Mikado, I believe, was a Japanese term for the locomotive, and the nickname was called, I believe, Empress or whatever. What Mikado means, I'm pretty sure. And so this is a Mikado type, and there was like at least a pretty good amount of them built for many railroads.
All right, so most of it was used for freight.
Yes.
So this type of engine would not have been utilized in the passenger aspect of transportation at this time?
Not really, unless you think about excursion services.
I want to bring somebody else in here. Come here, Stephen. This individual is known as Stephen Wing in our part of the area, and he's a train enthusiast himself, and he may have a question for Zane that he would like to. You got anything you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'll just add on, once these were made, and they were such an early type, once World War II broke out, they transferred the name of Mikado and started calling them MacArthur locomotives, because just the type of what's going on.
The stigma of
right,
the fact
correct,
that we're being
yes.
Japanese when we were in a war.
Yes, and one thing about these could pull and push just as hard either way, and that's one thing that made them so valuable in freight and stuff like that. And another interesting fact is that they could get a top speed of about 52 miles an hour, and I don't know about y'all, but I would not want to be doing 52 miles an hour on this thing.
Well, at that time, it was all they had.
That's all they had.
There's some books that were written by Lamar Hurst, Mr. Hurst, who was the teacher here, that he talks about a train that went through Blackshear at 100 miles an hour in the last mail contract that was awarded in this part of the United States. But anyway, that's off the subject. What else can we talk about this big thing? It's a big chunk of iron. How long did it take to manufacture something like this?
Maybe, I guess, maybe a few months, maybe a year.
Really? That's all?
Back then, they had so many people at the Baldwin Locomotive Works, they could have like at least 100 people working on the thing.
So all of this had to be forged, welded primarily at that time. Mm-hmm. And welding was kind of a antique type of thing, wasn't it? That wasn't utilized very well at that time. Most of it was what we would call blacksmith work.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was pretty labor intensive to try to build.
And all the rivets and everything, it took time. And I believe it weighed 100 tons fully loaded down. So
really? Would they have used 2 of these at one time, or it only have to have 1 at one time?
Some occasions they would use 2 of them on the same train if the train was a little bit too heavy, and they would have 2 of them help each other out. But most of the time, it would run solo.
Independently. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, that's great.
How much coal would it take for a trip, say?
Ooh, that's a real good question.
Well, but all of these were coal burning.
Yeah,
they were coal burning.
Most of them. Across the United States, there was, of course, most of them were coal burners, but then some parts in the western part of the United States, some of them were probably oil burners due to the dry areas. Don't want to start any grass fires and all that. So they were trying to be safe with that.
And since it was steam operated, they had to have water stations every so many miles, didn't they?
Yes.
Oh yeah. One thing that's interesting to me, I never knew this until a few months ago. The coal tender also doubled as a water tank too. It had on the sides of it, the water tank was built all the way around to hold extra water for the steam engine. I thought that was a very interesting.
That's good utilization of space.
Yes.
Yeah, that's just like the airplanes today. Just put the gas in the wings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's great. It took 1 engineer, 2 engineers, and a coal. What would we call the person
Fireman.
that did all the coal?
Fireman.
The fireman.
So the engineer would have sat on the earth side where the throttle was, and the fireman would sit right here, and he would shovel in the coal, and he would make sure to keep the boiler pressure steady.
Yeah.
And if it got too hot and they try to add a little bit of water, the boiler could explode. So it took them 2 people to make sure this thing was stable and safe to operate.
Was at that time explosions on these locomotives a safety factor? Did that occur from time to time?
Sometimes.
Just like anything else, I guess, if you didn't pay attention to it,
Yeah.
it would happen.
It was more common in the late 1800s.
When they were just getting cranked up with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then it kind of died down throughout the steam era, but there was still a few that end up having boiler explosions.
When did these engines basically go out of service? And then was it the diesel? What changed the industry?
So it was in the middle of the 1940s, and the railroads were looking for cheaper engines to run, and that was the introduction of the diesel locomotive. And there was a few railroads who were not jumping on the idea right away because they were still liking the steam locomotives pretty well. But there was a few manufacturers like EMD and Alco that were built the diesel engines, and they would send them out to some railroads to test. And you could say steam fought off as long as they could until the railroads just had no choice but to cut off the steam operations.
Was the advancement in from steam then into diesel simply a factor of economy? Was it a factor of more efficient work with an engine? What made them change?
It was more of the economy.
Economy?
Yes. It could take, so say this locomotive could only go so many miles without having to refuel and coal. But with the diesel engines, they can go a few more miles longer than the steam engine. And there's a few of them that you can have 4 engines hooked up together and they can pull the same amount of weight as the steam locomotives could on some freight trains.
Okay.
Okay, so right here, this is the cylinder, and this is where the valve gear of the locomotive. So whenever steam goes through the boiler, it comes down here. There's a piston down here that would drive the locomotive either forward and reverse. And whenever usually steam would come out right here, and whenever the steam pressure pushes against the piston, it would push right back, and that would drove the engine's movement. And I'm pretty sure right here, this is the air compressor or whatever, something like that. I'm not too big on knowledge of the mechanical side of the steam engine, but pretty sure this is the air compressor. Then right here, this is where they have the domes. There would have been, in one of them, that's where they would have sand stored in it. Because if a locomotive would stall on a grade, they can apply sand and it would take traction and all that. That pipe there. Yeah, that pipe right, this pipe right here, this is what's allowed the sand to get down to the wheels to help get the locomotive going. So, and then of course right here,
I'm watching.
this is where the firebox is. This is where they would shovel the coal into the locomotive, and that's what helped produce the steam. And they would have a little bit of water in the boiler that would help produce steam. And it'll be hard to see inside, but they have like boiler tubes, and that's what helped push some of the steam through the boilers with the boiler tubes. So this is what really helped the locomotive get its power from and all that. So
what about the number of drive wheels? What's the we talk about that sometime.
So the drive wheels, there's 8 of them. There's 4 on each side. This is the main wheels that would help produce the motion of the locomotive, what gets it going. And the wheels right here, this is what they call the pilot wheel. That just helps keep the locomotive stable and turns. And right here, if you look, they have wheels back here.
Okay.
Underneath the firebox. Because the firebox was so heavy, they needed something to support it, so that's where the wheels came in. Right here. So this is what they call the trailing wheels. So those would have been 2 on each, 1 on each side. And that's pretty much, so those are the drivers, or driving wheels.
The big wheels.
The big wheels.
Were there trains that had more of the big wheels?
Well, the limit of most locomotives were 8. Unless you want to talk about the Union Pacific articulated locomotives, like the Union Pacific Challenger or the Big Boy. Now, the Big Boy had 8 of these, but again, since it was articulated, there was technically they had one section that was 8, and then another section back here that would have been another 8 sets of driving wheels, since the boiler was so large.
All right. Why did it articulate? And tell me how it articulated.
Well, this was during World War II, and the railroad was looking for a lot more powerful locomotives, and so they would increase the boiler size, and once the boiler increased in size, there was more wheels, and at one point it would get from like a 484, which is like a northern type, to a 210-4, which that would have been 5 driving wheels on each side. And at one point there was a 412-2, which was like a massive locomotive, which one is still around today, and there would have been like 6 driving wheels on each side. And when you look at it, they were great on the plains, but when it comes to the curvy hills, they were so stiff they could
didn't function well.
So that's when the articulates came in, because they had a hinge pin between the middle of the locomotive where the one section could move around tighter curves while the boiler would stay stationary. The frame of the wheels would go around the curves and help the locomotive with that. So on this locomotive, it's a rigid frame, so it's not like an articulated. So since it has a small number of wheels, it would be able to go around tighter curves. And so the number of wheels is the main factor of why most locomotives can take some corners while some larger engines can't. So this locomotive was the perfect size to take some tight curves and all that. Now I'm not sure about the width of the wheels on the height, but there were some locomotives that could get up to maybe 80-inch drivers, which that's a pretty big size wheel.
That's a huge wheel.
Yeah.
I think these are 38s, if I remember right. 38s or something.
I'm pretty sure they're 38-inch drivers. But yeah, there were some locomotives out there that can have 80-inch wheels, which the bigger the wheel, sometimes the more powerful the locomotive is. But this locomotive itself is still pretty powerful, especially the size of the boiler. This is where the firebox door was. This is where the fireman would open up the door to shovel coal from the tender. Now right here, this is the throttle. This is what was able to get the locomotive going. Right here, this is the reverser. If you push it forward, that would make the locomotive go forward. If you pull it back, that's what allowed it to reverse. I'm pretty sure this right here is the brake, and then another one would have been maybe the air brakes. For the air brakes would have been hooked up to the freight cars or any other like passenger cars. If you pull on it a little bit, it would make all the brakes on the train car wheels to apply and maybe stop a little bit easier than just applying the locomotive brake. And now here's all the gauges. Right here, that's the air brake gauge. It shows how much pressure is being applied. Right here, that's the, I'm pretty sure that's the main locomotive boiler pressure and all that. And then over there, there would have been somewhere right there where the fireman can see the water glass and make sure where he can see how much water is in the boiler. And again, you have all the rest of these like little valves to help provide, make sure the locomotive's in good shape to move.
Okay. All right. Zane, I don't know any more questions to ask. You've covered a lot more knowledge than I even thought about occurred, but it's interesting. And I guess the rail industry was just like the transportation on the rivers. Everything had to change. The steamboat went to power, and they went from wood to iron. So it was just a part of moving along in the industry, a part of revolution, I guess you would call it. And one thing though I do want to ask, we always call it a diesel train. Why do we call it primarily a diesel train? Because if I'm not mistaken, that diesel train's run on electricity, is that right?
It has an electric motor in it, but the fuel in it is carrying diesel, and that's what powers the motors. And
in order to generate the electricity to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. We moved from one generation to another really quickly. Zane, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your knowledge. Stephen, we appreciate you stepping in and commenting as well. And we hope that you will come out and take a look at 09, because it ain't going nowhere. It's going to be right here. It's how much did it weigh?
100 tons.
100 tons.
100 tons. So it's going to be here on one place. As we age, you know, we have that same factor. Our tonnage begins to increase, but this one won't. It'll stay right here. So we're delighted that you took the time to be with us this morning. We appreciate everyone's comments. And come out and celebrate with us at the Okefenokee Heritage Center in Waycross. We'll see you a little later on. Yeah, they're big on the bell. Let me zoom in a little bit.
When you zoom it,
All right. There you go.